From Show and Price piece on U.S. President Donald Trump's unveiling of a new board of peace at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, a body that he says could move beyond the Gaza ceasefire and take on a wider role in resolving international conflicts, even as questions grow about whether it could challenge the authority of the United Nations. We now get a Pan-African perspective on what this means for global diplomacy and Africa's voice in a changing world order. We're joined by Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, who is director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of the Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg, South Africa. Professor, welcome to Channel Africa. Good morning.
Good morning.
President Trump has announced this board of peace at Davos, Switzerland, suggesting it could take on a global role and even replace the United Nations or the functions thereof. From your perspective, how credible is this initiative, and does he have the power to replace some of the functions of the UN?
This board has been controversial because of that objective of attempting to replace the United Nations. I think Trump has suggested that it may work with the United Nations, but it's not very clear at this point whether in fact that objective will be fulfilled or whether the board is going to take over the roles of the UN or the Security Council. So that is the biggest contention here. And my belief is that if you look at, in fact, the current membership of that board, only 2 African countries have been invited. That is Egypt and Morocco. And you can see from those 2 countries that these are not actually representative of what you call the continent of Africa. So it's already problematic for a board that is going to work on peace and conflict issues. And these peace and conflict issues often affect African countries. So how is this board going to operate without meaningful representation of African countries? And the other point that I want to make is that it is not very clear whether Mr. Trump is going to step down when he leaves the presidency, because the charter of the board gives him a mandate to govern forever as the chair of this board. And I think that is making most countries very nervous. How is that role going to conflict with the goals of the United States as a government once Mr. Trump leaves office? So these are the third issue is, of course, the funding. Some members are supposed to contribute $1 billion, and there will be permanent members of this board. And if you can't afford the $1 billion, then you stay on the board for 3 years and get out. And that is a very problematic component of an organization that is supposed to deal with global issues, that is supposed to be legitimate, that is supposed to work with the rest of international institutions such as the UN. And that's why everybody is nervous. Even the Europeans are nervous. But I think we in Africa should even be more nervous, because this is now a new institution that may not likely have the interests of the continents at heart.
With those who are nervous, as a tool of resolving international conflict, this board of peace, could it be seen as a competitor to the United Nations, and or could it both coexist with the UN and peacefully be a board of peace while the UN also continues with its functions?
The positive side to the board would be to supplement existing international instruments, such as the United Nations, such as the G7, the G20, and these other multilateral institutions, even the African Union, if we could put it that way. So that would not be a problem, because it's going to help in probably mobilizing resources for some of these conflicts. The worry, and this is the negative component, is that if you have a new institution of this nature, particularly an institution that is created by the United States, a United States that is withdrawing pulling away from most of its obligations at the UN, what you're going to end up with is an institution that essentially competes with the UN. And it competes with the UN in very unfavorable terms, because if the United States is stopping to pay its membership dues or contributions to major functions of the UN in terms of peace, in terms of stability, in terms of governance, then it will be very difficult for the UN to operate. So that is the argument for the potential for this institution to essentially supplant the UN and not really work with the UN, deprive the UN of the resources it needs. So this is really the danger that everybody is worried about. But if it is going to help the UN, well and good, because the more resources we have globally for some of these big issues on peace and security, I think the better. But it's too early now to tell whether the Board of Peace is going to supplement or to supplant the United Nations. And I think these are the worries. And then, of course, membership. Who is going to sit at the table? Africa has been demanding for representation in the UN Security Council. And now we have a new institution that barely talks about Africa. We have a new institution that simply ignores Africa. This is a problem for the board going forward. Maybe Trump may change his mind and invite countries such as South Africa down the road, but currently it doesn't look like there will be a meaningful African representation on that board.
On that point then of membership, 59 countries have reportedly joined this Board of Peace, mostly from the Middle East and some democracies. And then on the African continent, as you mentioned, only 2 form part, Egypt and Morocco. So how should Africa view this? And should they want to be involved then in terms of changing that representation? Or should they just see this as a symbolic thing?
I think Africa is going to look at the board as pretty much a symbolic thing. Egypt is important only because of the objective of Gaza. Egypt is a neighbor to Gaza, so I can see why they will be invited. But I think remaining silent on the rest of the continent, I think that is a bigger problem. And it's very clear that there is not going to be any African representation beyond those 2 countries. If we go by what happened yesterday, because that's when the board was unveiled. But yesterday you had only 20 countries coming on board. So presumably there will be more countries being invited, or the 59 probably would then, some countries, even the Pope has been invited to be a member of the board. So we'll see whether in the coming days, whether there will be more countries joining the board. And then we can then start to really worry about Africa, because if there's no African invitation, let's say a year from today, then it deepens, in fact, the perspective that this is an organization that doesn't care about Africa, and therefore it is not going to be as effective in dealing with African conflicts as the United Nations has been doing over the years.
Professor, thank you so much for your valuable insights and your time, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Thank you. Professor Gilbert Khadiagala is director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of the Witwatersrand. It's based here in South Africa, talking to us about U.S. President Donald Trump saying we need a board of peace that goes beyond what it was originally formed for, which was the Gaza ceasefire. As the UN Security Council had said, it can go ahead on that and only that. He says let's expand it now and deal with other international conflicts as what the mandates of the UN would be. We'll see how Africa places itself on that one. 8 o'clock Central African time, and we get our news update. We enter also the third hour of Rise and Shine. Here's Jwalane Tulongwepe.